Hey there, my name is Max Kreminski. Today I'm presenting our work on the automatic graphical summarization of creative activity traces via a technique that we're calling fuzzy linkography. It stems directly from this question of trying to characterize the trajectory of co-creative interactions at scale. As we deploy more and more digital creativity support tools, including those that have AI in them in various ways, we start encountering more and more situations where we're logging lots and lots of creative behavior, where there's thousands or millions of users all interacting with these digital tools and doing creative stuff. But the characterization of what's going on in those traces is actually quite tough. It's hard to look at thousands of these, let alone millions, and start to really piece together what's happening in them. And so we find ourselves looking for a way to maybe visualize or characterize or qualify what broad dynamics or sort of interaction patterns are starting to emerge in the logs of user behaviors with these various creative tools. It would be really great if we could do this analysis using Linkography. This is a technique that was introduced in the early 1990s. Originally, it was kind of used to study how human architects collaborate on the design of buildings. It's been applied to a bunch of other creative contexts since then. I'm not going to do a full introduction to it here because it's got a long and storied history, and I think some people in this community already know it pretty well. But the basic idea is that you annotate a creative interaction as it unfolds as a series of design moves, where each design move is a way of updating the design situation in some sense. And in this particular linkograph here, we can sort of see that each move is represented by a red dot. They're kind of a timeline from left to right, so each move that unfolds kind of follows on from the previous moves. And when a move builds on or relates back to something that was done in a previous move, we draw a link between these two moves below the timeline. And so you can see here that you've got kind of a characteristic web structure in which all of moves 0 through 3 are related to one another in some sense. Move 4 is an orphan, or kind of an ignored digression in this sequence. There's some relationships, but not as dense. This is kind of a chunk from moves 5 to 9. And then finally, from moves 9 through 12, we have a sawtooth pattern, where each move directly responds to the previous one, but doesn't sort of like reintegrate into the broader themes of the session as a whole. The problem with this technique, though, is that it's typically sort of constructed by hand. We typically kind of have human annotators come in, look at the transcript of a design session, break it up into design moves, and then manually annotate these links below that timeline. And as a result, this is very costly to apply at scale. It's very hard to scale it to thousands of these different traces that we're producing from these digital creativity support tools that we're now deploying in the wild. But what we're working on is this technique called fuzzy linkography, where you can start to not necessarily fully automate the production of linkographs, but at least start to automatically assess the relationships between the moves in a transcript of actions that you've already captured when you have a user working with a creativity support tool. Here we have kind of an example fuzzy linkograph, and you might notice that something has kind of changed between this and the previous slide, namely that the links between the moves in our fuzzy graphs are actually of different strengths, depending on how semantically associated a text embedding model thinks these moves are with one another. So you can see this is kind of an open-ended sort of creative ideation to sort of brainstorming session, where we have a few broad themes emerging. Initially kind of greetings, hello and hello world, a bunch of animals are listed off. Hello Kitty kind of integrates these themes. Then there's kind of a digression about riverbanks and streams that gradually turns into more of a video thing. And then it all kind of comes together at the end with Hello Kitty TV show. And the embedding model is giving us back these semantic association strengths that allows us to automatically draw out the links between each of these ideas that's kind of tossed out in this ideation context. And so this fuzzy linkograph kind of summarizes the structure of this design session as a whole. We see where the divergences happen, we see where the convergences happen, and we can start to assess automatically, as long as we've got one of these traces of ideation, where these sort of associations are strongest. And in order to actually apply this to real data, we actually sort of took the traces that we saw people getting out of this patchwork tool that we built, this kind of an open-ended image generation plus world building canvas that we have currently deployed in the wild, and looked specifically at the 6,000 something traces of interaction that people produced with this tool through the 2-week period at the end of 2024, right after we just launched it last year. So we basically applied fuzzy linkography to all of these traces, generated thousands and thousands of linkographs. This is possibly the largest scale deployment of linkography that has yet been done, and started looking at these linkographs to see what patterns we could suss out in the way that people were doing image prompting in this open-ended canvas kind of space. There's actually a whole bunch of interesting recurring patterns. I'm not going to have time to talk about them all in depth. The first one that we see over and over again is what we call a refinement web. There's one over here, there's another one over here in this graph. And a refinement web, as you can see, involves a bunch of different moves or image prompts that are all closely related to one another. And this typically in practice tends to indicate the user doing a pattern of convergence on a narrower and narrower goal as they proceed from the beginning to the end of this web. They might have a prompt that they're very gradually modifying, making smaller and smaller tweaks to, in order to converge on an idea that they're sure they want to see an image of. And you see these sort of strong networks of association between moves that are intended to get them closer and closer to the goal they have in their head. At a longer range, however, we also see patterns like the curiosity zigzag. Here we can see that there's kind of these zigzag patterns where a user is going back and forth between thinking about some theme that's one that they keep revisiting, and thinking about or prompting for themes that are more unrelated or divergent. In the middle here, we see this kind of like a chunk of related moves that are not actually that tied into the rest of the graph. But we also see them kind of ping-ponging back and forth between things like these and things like these at the end, while also performing lots of orphan moves or just sort of like divergent prompts that don't necessarily relate back to other things that have been explored in this session so far. So we see here that this really interesting sort of back and forth between exploring out further and pushing the boundaries of the space and kind of trying to develop some central idea that they keep coming back to. When you see combinations of these patterns where it starts to get really interesting, though. This is a converging zigzag that kind of combines the curiosity zigzag pattern we saw previously and the refinement web structure that we also looked at. And in this particular graph, what we see is a user first converging on a single character concept, which is sort of a cute old man, and then exploring another one, which is a man with the head of a tick. And then they start to kind of gradually draw together the different ideations that they've done into a single hybrid character concept, while also beginning to sketch out like a kind of a visual style that they haven't really related to their other ideas yet. Then there's kind of a temporal break in prompting where they walk away for a while, indicated by this vertical dotted line. And then on the right-hand side, we see them starting to simultaneously put their character into different situations and explore the development of that visual style. And then ultimately at the end, there's kind of this gigantic refinement web where the link patterns actually strengthen periodically as they get closer and closer to their like sort of final vision, where they start putting that character they've created into this style they've developed. And this produces a really interesting sort of hybridization structure where you can sort of see the visual sort of bringing together of these concepts as they develop their ideas. So this is really neat. Again, looking at these temporal breaks from prompting, we can see that sometimes users prompt in very clearly temporally divided sessions, where when they walk away, it kind of clears out their semantic context and they do entirely different prompting when they come back later on. Whereas some users develop these much more elaborate running projects, and they keep coming back to the same ideas over and over again, despite all of these different breaks in prompting that they do. This user in particular was actually developing kind of an avatar-inspired fantasy world, and each of these refinement webs in the structure indicates them kind of converging on the canonical image of a particular character or a faction, or like a location in this sort of shared setting they're building out. And when we can sort of cluster these linkographs, we also start to see designer archetypes, the very beginnings of people using this tool in different ways. And you could imagine using a much more sophisticated version of this clustering to start figuring out automatically what usage patterns this user is doing and whether the user interface could be shaped towards their interests or their patterns. So this is kind of a cool direction for future work. We also took these same techniques and applied them to the reanalysis of the ChatGPT homogenization effect data that we presented here last year. So you might remember this study as being a sort of comparison between ChatGPT and the oblique strategies deck as ideation support tools, where we saw that ChatGPT users ended up producing more homogeneous or similar ideas to one another. And what we actually introduced here was a technique that we call multi-actor fuzzy linkography to look at the influence patterns between the human and the machine in this study. Here we kind of denote that user-created moves or user-submitted ideas are red, whereas when the machine generates an idea, that's marked here as blue. And we start to look at the links between them to kind of figure out whether the user is influencing the machine more or vice versa. And when we look at them in this way, we can start to see visible evidence of AI misfires. There's a big cluster of ChatGPT submitted ideas here that are actually all just kind of related to one another quite strongly, but that are also clearly not what the user was looking for because they don't get integrated and the user kind of immediately reprompts for different ideas instead. We see here that user ideas start out pretty diverse in the beginning, so it's not really that the user is coming up with very similar ideas to one another, to themselves, but we also see that the ChatGPT ideas tend to come in very large batches at once, and those batches are quite closely interrelated to one another. So there's a lot of strong links between the ChatGPT ideas in any given batch, even though the batches tend to be relatively dissimilar from one another. And as the interaction proceeds, ChatGPT ideas tend to get even more similar to one another. The links between ideas in this first batch here are not as strong as the links in this last batch in particular. And you can see this across a lot of these different graphs. We think this is because as the conversation proceeds, there's more and more ChatGPT output because it's so verbose in the context window. And so the machine starts getting more and more conditioned on the way that it already writes and the ideas it already has come up with. Users in all of these graphs basically eventually switch into what we call a predominantly curationist mode, where they're more focused on filtering and integrating ChatGPT output than on introducing their own ideas. We see that happen after the first batch of prompting here, but we see this in a lot of these different graphs. And ChatGPT ideas, interestingly, don't build much on user ideas. When there's links between these two actors, the influence mostly goes from the machine to the user instead of the other way around. So here, we think this is partly because users are often noticing and saying out loud during the study things that they're frustrated with or things that they like to change about the ChatGPT output, but not re-encoding it into the conversation. They don't actually sort of like type it into the computer, so there's no way for the machine to adapt to this additional feedback they'd like to give it. We think this is really interesting and suggests a really big problem with the chatbot interaction in these kinds of ideation contexts. And of course, these dynamics recur across lots of different ideation sessions. Users were using these tools very differently, prompting them in different strategies, and we see very different levels of overall link density, but these overall patterns tend to be the same regardless. So there's something about the interaction that sort of shapes people into behaving in certain ways that then produce the homogenization effect. It's more a human-AI interaction effect than something about the AI in particular. And we can even do some quantitative analysis looking at aggregate backlink densities to kind of confirm these high-level patterns that we've observed. The machine links back to the machine more than it links back to the human. The human links back to the human more than they link back to the machine. And insofar as there's any interactor influence, it's mostly the human incorporating ideas from the machine into their own ideation and not the other way around. And this has a lot of interesting implications, I think, for co-creative interactions. If we can build these fuzzy linkographs in real time, we can start to automatically assess when might be a good time for the machine to not get involved when the user is in a convergence mode. We can start to look at which ideas have not been brought together or integrated in the past of the session, which is kind of cool. And we can also suggest proactive elicitation of intent when the machine ideas start to be not linking back to the users particularly. So we can kind of notice these problems emerging and maybe start to intervene proactively in the interaction. And because this is all based on the use of embedding models to kind of gauge semantic similarity between artifacts, we can also extend these strategies to new creative domains beyond just text and images, as long as there's a good embedding model. So things like UI clip, for instance, could be used to extend this to a user interface design context. More generally, I think this idea of linkographic abundance is really interesting to explore. Linkography used to be a really expensive technique, but if you can generate lots of sort of mid-quality linkographs really quickly, you can start probing new design spaces and new research ideas just by introducing linkography as kind of a speculative first pass move. And we actually talk about this a bit in the paper where we actually apply fuzzy linkography to the analysis of sequences of publications by individual researchers as cataloged by Google Scholar and start to see if there's like career shapes that you can sort of gauge linkographically. I think this is kind of a thing that we're going to want to gauge more in the future, but it's a really interesting shift in the overall sort of dynamics of when you might apply linkography as a technique. Thank you.